When Karoline Leavitt stepped into the Oak Room, she expected everything to be just as it had always been. This place wasn't just a restaurant to her, it was a familiar, comfortable haven where the routine never changed. Normally, the moment she walked in, her usual waiter would greet her with a smile, and the staff would acknowledge her like an old friend. But today was different. There was tension in the air, thick and almost tangible. Her instincts immediately told her that something was off. Usually, the waiters passed by her with warm smiles, but now, they were avoiding eye contact, looking away as if pretending not to notice her. Something was going on, but Karoline had no idea what. She scanned the restaurant. People were eating, talking in hushed voices, but there was an odd stillness, a strange quiet, like the calm before a storm. She took a deep breath and made her way to her usual table. Just as she settled into her seat, her eyes locked onto an unfamiliar face. Across the room stood a man in a dark suit, his face expressionless, his gaze sharp. He wasn't a customer. No, his presence felt different, more like someone brought in to handle a situation. He wasn't even pretending to blend in. Instead, he was watching her, studying her every move. That look, it wasn't new to Karoline. She had seen it before. Her instincts immediately sharpened as she sat up straighter, trying to figure out why this man was fixated on her. At that moment, a waiter hesitantly approached her table. Karoline was ready to order as usual, but something in the waiter's demeanor caught her attention. "What can I get for you today, Miss Leavitt?" His voice had a slight tremor. "The usual: grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and a plain soda," Karoline replied, keeping her gaze locked on the waiter. He pulled out his notepad, pen in hand, but then hesitated as if about to say something. Karoline narrowed her eyes. "Is there a problem?" Before the waiter could respond, the man in the suit made his move. His steps were firm, deliberate. Something about the way he approached sent a strange, uneasy feeling to the pit of Karoline's stomach. He stopped just beside her table, standing a little too close. "Excuse me," he said, his tone cold and commanding. Karoline looked up. "Yes?" The man leaned in slightly, his face void of any politeness. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her brows furrowed. Had she heard him correctly? "Excuse me?" The man's expression remained unchanged. He took a step closer, his voice lowering but no less firm. "You need to leave. Now." The restaurant's usual chatter continued, but Karoline could feel the shift. People were now watching, stealing quick glances in her direction. Something was definitely wrong. She felt an uneasy stir inside her. Something wasn't right. "I'm sorry, but may I ask why?" Her voice remained calm, but she could feel anger bubbling beneath the surface. The man held his gaze. "I don't have to explain that to you." Karoline's patience was wearing thin. "Oh, really?" she said, her tone now edged with steel. "I've been coming here for years and I've never had an issue before. If you're going to throw me out, at least give me a reason." The man's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked over to the back of the restaurant, toward the kitchen doors where the manager stood, watching. Up until now, he had remained silent, offering no intervention. That was when Karoline knew. This wasn't just some random misunderstanding. The man finally spoke again. "You're making other customers uncomfortable." Karoline raised an eyebrow. She scanned the room. No one seemed remotely bothered. People were still eating, still chatting. "Really?" she asked, her tone now openly challenging. "Who exactly is uncomfortable? Can you point them out to me?" The man's expression hardened, but he didn't respond. Karoline followed his gaze, just for a second. His eyes darted toward the manager again. That was all she needed. This man wasn't acting on his own, he was following orders. But whose orders? And why? Karoline leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she looked directly at him. "I don't know what's really going on here," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm not leaving until I get an answer." A hush fell over the room. The manager's eyes flicked nervously between Karoline and the man in the suit. Then, the restaurant's back door swung open, and in walked Joan, the owner of the Oak Room. There was no warm smile on her face, no usual friendly demeanor. Her expression was stone cold. Karoline's lips curled into a slight smirk as she watched Joan approach. Things had just gotten interesting, and Karoline wasn't going anywhere. The moment Joan stepped inside, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted. The hushed whispers of the customers came to a stop, and waiters exchanged uneasy glances. Karoline knew Joan well. The owner of the Oak Room was always polite, but she commanded authority. Today, however, her face was harder than usual. Too hard. Karoline leaned back in her chair, keeping her eyes locked on Joan. Now, she was sure, the person pulling the strings in this little stunt was standing right in front of her. This wasn't just some misunderstanding, this was deliberate. But why? Joan walked forward at a steady pace. As she reached the man in the suit, she leaned in and whispered something to him. The man took a step back but didn't leave entirely. Karoline noticed how he positioned himself closer to the door, as if still monitoring the situation. This wasn't a mistake. This was part of a plan. Finally, Joan arrived at Karoline's table, inhaled deeply, and spoke with a fake sense of politeness. "Karoline," she said, her voice soft but distant, "we think it would be best if you weren't here today." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" she replied, her voice calm, but the growing fire in her chest was impossible to ignore. "And why is that?" Joan hesitated for a moment. Behind her, the restaurant manager shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the air thickened by the second. "Some customers have expressed that they feel uncomfortable with your presence," Joan finally said. "We've had a few complaints before." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Uncomfortable?" she repeated. "Which customers? And exactly what made them uncomfortable?" That question seemed to hit a nerve. Joan stiffened. The restaurant manager's face tensed as well. The other customers were no longer pretending not to listen. Now their eyes were fixed on Karoline. She scanned the room. Most of them looked away the second she met their gaze. But not all of them. A few, the ones who looked like the man in the suit, stared straight at her. No hesitation, no shame. There was something bigger at play here. And Karoline wasn't about to swallow this ridiculous excuse. Joan averted her eyes and continued, "Karoline, please don't make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. This is a dining establishment. Our customers deserve to feel at ease." Karoline let out a small laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "So now it's about feeling at ease, huh?" she said, a sharp edge in her voice. "I've been coming here for years. Never once has anyone had an issue with me. But suddenly, out of nowhere, I'm a problem?" Joan's face tightened. She looked like she wanted to end this conversation as quickly as possible. "It's a decision, Karoline," she said, blunt and firm, "and you need to respect it." Karoline took a slow, deep breath. No, this wasn't a decision. This was an orchestrated move to silence her. Someone wanted her gone. And whether Joan was doing this willingly or being pressured, she was playing into their hands. Suddenly, from across the restaurant, a man lifted his phone and started recording her. Karoline's stomach twisted. That was it. This wasn't about a restaurant policy. This wasn't about a disruption. This was a show, a planned spectacle to send a message. Karoline's face hardened. Slowly, she placed her hands on the table, then reached for her bag with deliberate, steady movements. She locked eyes with Joan. "If you really want me out of here, then just say it outright," she said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "But don't lie to me." She narrowed her eyes. "I want to know exactly who was uncomfortable. Who made this decision?" Joan didn't answer immediately. She hesitated, and for the first time there was something in her face. Guilt. Then the kitchen doors swung open. 2 more men stepped inside. Karoline turned her head slightly, sizing them up. And deep down, she already knew. These weren't regular customers. This was bigger than she thought. Behind Joan, the restaurant manager still stood frozen in place, too nervous to intervene. One of the new men walked forward, his steps slow, calculated. Karoline noticed the brief but clear exchange of glances between him and the first man in the suit. This was organized. Karoline knew it. And now she had a choice. She could stand down, walk away, let them have their victory. Or she could show them exactly who they were messing with. She took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Joan," she said, her voice dangerously low. "How many more people are you planning to bring in before I respect your decision?" At that moment, the entire restaurant felt like it was holding its breath. Karoline wasn't walking away, not without answers. This game wasn't over, it was just beginning. When Karoline stood up, the air inside the restaurant grew heavy. Everything in front of her had changed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a coordinated effort, a carefully planned move. Joan's gaze was tense. The restaurant manager looked uneasy. The suited men who had stepped out of the kitchen remained silent, but their presence alone sent a clear message. You don't belong here. But why? Karoline felt the fire inside her slowly morph into something sharper. Cold calculation. This wasn't the time to lash out. This was the time to understand who she was up against. Just as she was about to confront Joan again, she caught movement from the other side of the restaurant. A customer had pulled out their phone, recording the scene. Another person was typing something on their screen, whispering as they did. Then it hit her. This wasn't just about kicking her out. This was a takedown, a public humiliation. A slow, uneasy feeling crept up her spine. This wasn't just some whim of a few people in power. This was orchestrated. Someone had decided she wasn't just supposed to leave quietly. She needed to be discredited, diminished, destroyed. But why? Karoline took a step forward, locking eyes with Joan. Joan, let's be honest, she said, her voice no longer as calm. This isn't your decision. Who ordered this? Joan swallowed hard but didn't say a word. And then, the restaurant doors swung open. Two men entered. Karoline had never seen them before, but the way they carried themselves, the way they moved, they weren't just random customers. They belonged here, and not as diners. They made their way toward the back of the restaurant at a slow, deliberate pace. This wasn't a coincidence. Karoline's instincts screamed at her, but she refused to show a reaction. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she knew this wasn't just about her presence in a restaurant. She took another step forward. Joan, she said, her voice lower, sharper. Do you even know who these people are? Joan looked away. That was all Karoline needed to see. Joan was scared. The silence inside the restaurant grew thicker, heavier. The tension coiled around them like a vice. Customers stared, wide-eyed, barely breathing. Everyone in that room understood something was about to explode. Karoline inhaled deeply. She had her answer. Staying wasn't the point anymore. She didn't know the full truth yet, but she was going to find it. She slung her bag over her shoulder, let her gaze sweep across the entire restaurant, and slowly nodded. All right, she said, I'm leaving. But this wasn't surrender. This was taking the fight somewhere else. She turned, walking toward the exit, each step echoing in the hushed space. The customers were frozen. Joan and the manager, for the first time, looked relieved. They thought it was over. They were wrong. Right as Karoline reached the door, she stopped. The silence shattered. She turned back around. Her voice boomed across the entire restaurant. Listen up, everyone, she announced, her tone clear, unwavering. What happened here today? This isn't just about me. Someone wanted me silenced. But let me make this clear, this is just the beginning. Her eyes locked onto Joan's. And Joan, she said, her voice cutting like a blade, one day you're going to have to explain to me why you did this, in your own words. Joan looked like she had been struck. The suited men exchanged glances. Karoline now knew just how big this was. And she wasn't just in the game anymore, she was the game. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cold air outside. The night was crisp, the wind biting. But inside, she was burning. This wasn't over. And Karoline was going to find out exactly who started it.